The topic tonight is the 3-period lesson in cosmic education, or the 3-period lesson for the second plane of education. For Montessori, cosmic education was the way she referred to education for the second plane. I just want to bring in a little bit of terminology here, because there seems to be a widespread aversion to what is often referred to as Montessori jargon. And what happens when we avoid what we perceive as jargon, but is really very important terminology? We end up appropriating terms from other educational theorists and subtly changing the meaning. So I would like to just clarify some terms before we go forward. The first thing that is important is that idea of abstraction. Now, memorization is not abstraction, and abstraction is not memorization. These are two different things. Memorization and recall are actually not quite the same thing. And working something out on paper or writing it down is also not abstraction. So what indeed is abstraction? Abstraction is a continuum from concrete to abstract. Ian Standing, who wrote Maria Montessori, Her Life and Work, has a very nice section on this. It's well worth reading. And he says there are 4 stages. The one is we'll start with a material object, say a cup. I have a mason jar here, so I'll just hold that up for you. I have this thing in my hand. I have a sensation of it. So I can say, in this case, mason jar. Then at some point, I might form a mental image of that object. So the child, having handled the cup, having said the word, they've got a sensation, and they've handled numerous cups that might be slightly different. They can form a mental image of what a cup is, but they still have a picture of a cup. Abstraction is the pure idea, the very essence of what makes a cup, cupness, right? But then I could see a mushroom with the top part, and I can say that's a cup mushroom. The mushroom has a cup as its top. I could see a valley and say the valley is like a cup. So we have the ability to transfer that idea of cupness. And we could say the same thing for just about anything else where we're looking at a process to abstraction. We do not have to write it down or work out something on paper to be able to abstract what a cup is. And once abstraction is reached, we can see cups in the negative, a negative drawing of a cup, and so on. I won't belabor this too long because of time, but it's actually worth reading what Standing says. So we have to realize that the point of all the Montessori materials is not primarily to teach something. We don't use the multiplication materials, for example, and its whole process to abstraction necessarily to teach multiplication, but to assist the mind in developing to a point of being able to abstract concepts. And that is not the same thing as working out long multiplication on paper. Working out long multiplication on paper doesn't necessarily imply that you understand what you're doing. You might know an algorithm, and therefore there is a correct calculation, but no abstraction. Another word we have to know is engrams. And this you don't often hear people talking about, but it's actually very important. So Montessori had this idea of subconscious traces. And the idea of these subconscious traces that are held in the brain of the child, in the mind of the child, works in conjunction with an idea called indirect preparation, that we use that term a little more, and then the idea of abstraction. So if we fully want to appreciate the power of the second period of learning, we have to engage with this idea of engrams. And we can think of them as a kind of neuronal pathway that is laid down through repetition, through engaging with ideas that might not even be completely conscious. So again, I'm quoting Annette Haynes. Each experience leaves a trace in the subconscious, and a number of such traces builds an ability that has the potential to build another ability. These engrams remind us when we forget. It's a sort of, there's something sitting there, I know it, I know the word, or I know the idea, I know the person, I know the place. The engrams remind us when we forget. A reassociation of engrams on account of our interest being aroused can lead to a higher and different level of thinking, a refinement of thinking, if you will. This results in elaborate internal intellectual structures of a cumulative sort, an association of ideas that organize themselves to carry out work we are unable to do consciously. It's when you think, where did that come from? How did I know that? How did I understand that? So really important article here to read if you can find it, The Origin of the Three-Period Lesson. Okay, and then what E.M. Standing says, and this is in the context of quite a long discussion of adults wanting to try to get the children to leave the materials in the hope that they will then somehow, if deprived of the materials, will reach abstraction. And he says a more real danger, and alas, one that is present in many schools, is that of hustling on the child's mind and forcing it to do sums in the abstract before it has formed a clear notion of the operation in the concrete. And while his example is referring to sums or mathematics, it actually applies to just about everything. So this tendency to rush children on to get them to abstract. And then the last term I just want to talk about is indirect preparation. Maria Montessori's idea of learning, her construct of learning, is predicated on her theory of indirect preparation. And it's not possible to fully understand the rationale of Montessori's curriculum without incorporating the notion that learning is seldom direct. And as such, the results of neither teaching nor the child's activity can be immediately and directly assessed. Thus, the notions that underpin things like outcomes-based and mastery theories of learning can't be applied in a Montessori context. Indirect preparation refers to the link between knowledge and the unconscious. And this idea informs all of Montessori's work. But it's not really fully or clearly explained after Pedagogical Anthropology, her first book. And that book's often skipped, and therefore this whole idea of indirect preparation and the role of engrams tends to be not examined as much as it would. And she uses the word indirect preparation thereafter as if it's been dealt with, and therefore you should know it, and let's get on. But this helps one understand the difference and the importance of differentiating between process and product in education. And it influences one's understanding of the idea, for example, of work being completed. When is work completed? If there's this long period of indirect preparation and process. So Montessori is based on incremental increases in difficulty. The incremental aspect is very different from the direct preparation of a conventional school. If you want to know more about this, Stephen Hughes actually has a really good video on this idea on Vimeo. So we get this warning from Maria Montessori: let the teacher not lose sight of the fact that the goal sought is not an immediate one. But we want to make the spiritual being which she is educating capable of finding the way by himself. And that is from childhood to adolescence. So in The Absorbent Mind, Montessori says children feel a special interest for those things already rendered familiar to them by absorption in the early period. On these, they can focus their minds with great ease. So things are presented in a way that the child is able to constantly engage with certain ideas. Another word I want to give you very quickly before we move on to specifically the second plane is the idea of a key. A key, when this word is used, means a unit of knowledge that opens the door to further knowledge. Keys are very limited, and only what is essential and sufficient constitutes a key. A key isolates a difficulty or a difference, or the point that we're trying to get across is isolated from other ideas. So if a lesson is given, we are not going to give every possible example. We just give an idea. It's a key that opens a door. And ordered keys, keys in order, keys in a structure, are derived from discipline. So the keys are drawn from academic subjects. And in another lecture or talk, I would very much like to explore with you the concept of a psychodiscipline, but that there is no time for right now. So, is any of what I've just told you relevant to the second plane child? Most of Montessori's writing about the 3-period lesson, indirect preparation, engrams even, are normally in the context of her books that she wrote about 3 to 6 years, that period, the first plane of development. Is any of this relevant to the second plane child, the child from age 6 to 12? Well, yes, but we must take into the account that we're dealing with a different child. And from that, we draw our inspiration from these two charts and all Maria Montessori's work on the 4 planes of development. Again, there's no time in this lecture to go into this in detail, but essentially we're talking about a child between the ages of 6 and 12 shown on these 2 very different charts that actually express the same thing. And for that age group, Montessori has identified needs, sensitivities, and manifestations that make that child very different from the child that we had from birth to 6 and also from the adolescent that we're going to have between 12 and 18. So we're dealing with a different personality, and that's very important to understand. And the second thing is that the methodology and framework of cosmic education impacts on the content of that 3-period lesson. So there is something called the 3-period lesson for adolescent, but I prefer to call it a 3-period learning cycle. Now, where does all of this come from? Because a lot of people have never really encountered the idea that there's a 3-period lesson or a 3-period learning cycle for 6 to 12s. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the history of that idea here. So I encountered this in 2 places. The first was from reading a doctoral thesis written by someone called Susan Fees. It was her doctoral thesis presented at the University of Sydney. You can download the whole thing. It's a doctoral thesis, so it's heavy. It's very theoretical. But essentially what she looks at is how that 3-period lesson that very simple 3-period lesson on the slide. It's up here, and don't try to read it right now, but it's worth actually getting this page, and we will share the link with you. You've got your 3-period language lesson, but you also see that the presentation of the Montessori materials becomes the first stage or the first period of a longer 3-stage cycle. Now, what Fees has done is she has looked at this whole structure of Montessori lessons and the way they're normally given, and analyzed it in terms of the educational theories of Basil Bernstein. Okay, I won't go into that in too much detail here now, but certainly in Australia and South Africa, I don't know if it's so much the case in teacher preparation in universities in the US, but very definitely Basil Bernstein seems to be the flavor. So he talks about ensembles, which are planned routines that are constantly designed to extend the child's meaning making to accommodate previously specified aspects of culture. So what that really is how you structure learning, how you structure your teaching to extend the child's ability to understand it and to accommodate it in whatever structure they already have. Her discussion is in terms of the Montessori grammar materials, and if you haven't ever really warmed to the grammar materials or understood them, I really urge you to have a look at this. So she talks about this ensemble of 3 stages. There's a presentation stage, a stage of independent work, and an extension stage, or a stage in which the child actually displays learning. And this is very, very important, because we now see that that very simple structure, remember when Annette Haynes said it's just the simple lesson structure, actually has a depth and complexity to it that infuses Montessori teaching when we are doing Montessori teaching correctly. So Montessori describes it in the following way. In our method, a lesson is only an explanation of an exercise. By far, the most important element is the work of the child himself in repeating it over and over again. So in the 3rd stage, we look at the child and we work out, is the child able to apply and benefit from this learning? And I'm not going to read that whole thing right there, right now. So I got to thinking when I read that is she just talking about the first plane? And then I realized no, because the whole thing's based on the grammar boxes. All her examples are to do with the grammar boxes. So she's talking about the 2nd plane. So the next stage of my awareness of this came when I attended the Hershey adolescent orientation course, the AMI NAMTA adolescent orientation course at Hershey, and attended lectures with David Kahn and Laurie Owert-Crocker, where it was made very clear that actually no, the elementary or the 6 to 9 phase, what in South Africa we call primary, the 3-period lesson is very much part of that, although Montessori herself doesn't make it explicit. But if we look at all the components, we see it's there. So the first sort of application of this seems to come from Bergamo, which is a Montessori training program in Italy, where it was suggested by John McNamara in 1972. I haven't been able to find a source other than the lectures that are cited. But he puts this so beautifully that in the first period, the adult offers a gift to a student, a bit of knowledge that is a gift. In the 2nd period, the child accepts that gift and begins to use it. And in the third period, there's some kind of representation of the learning that others can observe. Now, greater elaboration of this came out actually from developing the adolescent program and a teaching program for adolescents. Oh, this is, sorry, I should have put my phone off. This came out of the adolescent work. And they found that actually in trying to establish how to relate content to the adolescent mind naturally fell into a 3-period learning cycle as well. So relating that and the work of Susan Fies, it becomes clear that there really is a 3-period lesson or 3-period learning cycle that is relevant to to children between 6 and 12, our second plane children as well. Laurie Ewart-Crocker has written a lot about how this works as well for the second plane child. So most of what I'm saying is drawn from her writing and her lectures, but obviously with the application of the other theory. So let's have a look at the first period. It's primarily didactic, just as the first plane 3-period lesson is. But now it can take many forms, this first period. It can be a presentation. It can be just a straightforward lesson. It could just be giving a skill or terminology. But there's stories, there are charts, there are all sorts of things, materials that are used at this level. And this lesson is designed to arouse interest and emotion. Again, Montessori speaks in the very first writing on the 3-period lesson that you've got to get the interest of the child. The keys are isolated, key ideas, information, vocabulary, and experiences are isolated just as in the first period. In the first plane, but we're informed by the psychology of the second plane child. So whereas on the first plane, these presentations are given independently, the focus is on individual work. In the second plane, it's almost without exception. The first period is given to a group. So that's very important, and very important difference. If the teacher is trying to give these lessons individually, they'll just wear themselves out. It's got to be group work. It incorporates activity where appropriate, again, as with the first plane. It coincides with sensitivities, with manifestations of the second plane child. We've got this need, strong need to be in a group, the reasoning mind. We have limitations. We don't give everything. And the perceived limitations, often people say they're limits in Montessori. Like, why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? And then they try to create materials and lessons for those perceived gaps. The gaps are intentional because there needs to be space for the child to move into, for the child to work in. So we never give all the possibilities. And the lesson is always short. And then the adult observes the interest, where's the interest during this short lesson, and we invite the children to work. Note the word invite. So what happens in the second period? Well, I spoke about invitation. There's an invitation to work, not assigned work. Maybe there is no follow-up. Maybe the child does nothing after that lesson, because what we've done is we've sown a seed, and that seed might need time to lay dormant in the soil and germinate. We give a lesson and we move on. The children might in a group pick up on an idea. We've suggested ideas. We've got things in the environment that might stimulate some work, but maybe they don't. Maybe they don't take it. And that's okay, because we're going to give lots and lots and lots of keys. And some of the seeds will fall on fertile ground and grow, and others won't. So we've given our first period, and now we're moving into the second period. And at some point, the children pick up. Now, the lessons contain components, and each of these components, which are either impressionistic or factual, may be taken up by the children and become part of the work they do, but maybe not. They're stories. The stories capture interest. They can be impressionistic or factual. Montessori says that the Montessori teacher must be a storyteller of the truth. So the children listen to the stories, and they may go after other stories. They may tell their own. They might pick up on aspects of the story to go off on and explore. We do demonstrations, again, which may be impressionistic or factual, and the children may want to repeat those demonstrations, do similar ones, or go off on their own. We call them experiments when the children do them. We have charts and diagrams that the children could refer to. Lots of timelines that can be revisited multiple times over, or the children can make their own timelines. We have objects, images, and all sorts of diagrams available in our classrooms. We have resources to support independent work. Books, definitely. But these methods in the first period only suggest and don't dictate forms of work in the second. So it's all available. And then, of course, in those areas where appropriate, so and the second plane, mostly mathematics, geometry, and some in language, we have our concretized abstractions. I want you to think about what's not on this list. There are quite a few things. What is not on this list is death by card materials. We don't have command cards, task cards, instruction cards, 3-part cards, 2-part cards, work charts with labels to put on. We don't have workbooks or worksheets. We don't have worksheets that are laminated and put on the shelf in the incorrect notion that these are somehow become Montessori materials by being laminated. And we don't give the children planners or guidelines of what work they've got to do in the coming week. Because Montessori tells us that it's the child's choice here that is essential. We don't question their choice of what they're going to work on. And we have a very open-ended idea about what constitutes work, and that's an area that really needs engagement. The second period is now, it can be short or it can be a long period of time. When the child moves into the second period, we don't know how long it's going to be before they've really completed that learning. So it could be a long period of time. The second period on, let's just say, I don't know, long multiplication, could be years. We don't teach long multiplication today and expect the child to have somehow mastered it, somehow become an expert in long multiplication within a week or a month or even a year. It could take 6 years to reach abstraction. We're talking about abstraction, not mastery of a technique. Something very different, although we do have mastery of techniques in some areas. So it's unhurried and undisturbed. This is why we need our long work cycles. It's why we can't break our day into different subjects. You know, in the first hour, you'll do math, and then you'll do language, and then you'll do something else, and then, so we can't. Because firstly, the child, they're integrating everything. And they might choose very big work. In fact, if we're allowing the second plane tendencies to reveal themselves, the child or the children will be working in groups and they'll choose big work. And that is physically big and also big in terms of the kinds of concepts. So this is a period of practice. We are looking for process and not product. In fact, we need to make peace with the idea that we might end up with what to adults looks like unfinished work. The external work, the product, that what they're showing is really not the work of the second plane. The second plane is that child developing themselves so that they are ready on the cusp of adolescence to become members of society. And the children move to the third period of any learning continuum when they are ready. And that is individual, not independent. So we've got children working in groups on big ideas, big projects. We're giving lots of short lessons that are keys or seeds, first period lessons. The children are choosing from amongst that to engage in really deep exploration, and exploration is an important word here. So the implication of this is we are not setting deadlines. We are not giving them step-by-step, lockstep process towards some outcome, because we don't know what their outcome is. We don't know what they are thinking about. But having said that, we do need to make it possible for every child to be able to complete some things without limiting what they do. And that would be something like a child who's struggling to read should have access to small bits of paper, maybe a couple of centimeters, maybe 5 centimeters, about 3 centimeters, where they can write one word, and that's a finished project. That's a finished product. And then they can keep their best examples, staple them together, make a pretty cover, and they've got a book. That's a completed project. Or 3 children can get together and write lots of words and make a combined book. That is a collaboration. So that's just one of a million ideas. So what is the work of the adult in this process? Well, we've said there's no direct feedback regarding the child's efforts. We can observe and record and plan future lessons. In fact, the word should not be can, but should be we must. That's our job. So by not telling the child they're wrong, it doesn't mean we're not aware of when they make a mistake. We must be acutely aware. But the way we do it is by planning a new key, by giving a new key lesson to help them progress. We responsibly prepare or curate the environment. If we see an interest, we make sure that we've got the right resources in our environment. If we see the children are really into making dioramas, for example, we'll make sure that we've got the materials that they can use for that. And we scaffold sub-skills all the time. We can't say to a child, choose a topic to research and then do research, unless we've given them the keys, again, how to choose a topic, what is an appropriate topic for research. And what does research mean? We mustn't fall into the mistake of thinking that research entails writing some sort of a report, okay? So there are lots of things. Those are just some random ideas I came up with. I know very often children are asked to compose speeches when they've never listened to a speech. Write a play. What's a play? I've never been to a play. We need to make sure that we give children the experiences first and then help structure the work that can come into play in that second period. We also need to think very, very seriously, and this is a whole talk for another day, about the threats and the possibilities of technology. I think since the days of the very first personal computers, or those old Amstrads, and can't even remember what they were called, where you put the cassette tape into a player and then you had a little screen and a keyboard and a can't even remember if you had a keyboard, maybe they were just a mouse. But the point is, people in Montessori have been scared of that technology. We need to look at how our children can use technology in the second period. Technology is not the goal, it's the tool. So we must also remember in this whole story about the no direct feedback, and think about what the implications of that are for control of error. We have to get a clear understanding of control of error and how that plays out on this continuum between concrete and abstract. Control of error becomes increasingly abstract as soon as the child moves away from the knobbed cylinders to the pink tower. We do not, on the second plane, provide concrete control of error. The child is using an increasingly abstract control of error that involves looking at what they've done. Let's just use math as an example. Looking at a math problem and then say, well, we've got to help the child check if their answer's right. That is significantly missing the point. What we need to do is help the child know if the answer makes sense. Does it look like it could be right? Where would I expect this answer to fall? Between what range? That sort of thing, where children amongst themselves work out how to check their answer without being given the answer. Once they've got the answer, they're never going to look at the workings again. So the child must be freed from dependence on the adult, be freed from dependence on adult-assigned tasks, from dependence on the adult giving them the problem to solve, giving them the numbers for their calculations, giving them the questions they've got to answer. They need to be asking questions. So worksheets with questions for them to find the answers to. Missing the point. What question do you want to ask? That's the work of the second period. And obviously freeing them from dependence on readily available answers and solutions. So the adult has a very specific role during the second period. During this time, the adult supports the independent exploration of the child through regular dialogue check-ins to prompt thinking and extend work with the materials. And this helps the child to make connections between various concepts presented. So we have to see our children as reasoning explorers, reasoning explorers who formulate and solve problems, who have reasoning minds, who explore materials to arrive at laws, formulae, algorithms, and ultimately abstractions. We want them to discover the generalizations behind the exercises. In regular education, children are given definitions and formulae at the beginning, and then taught how to use those, how to perform different exercises. We want the children to struggle, to actually go along the path that humanity went to arrive at generalizations. We give them the keys, we give them the knowledge they need to get there, but we hope that they will arrive. And they have 6 years. They have a long time in elementary. If we give up on this idea that learning must be packaged into years, into these short blocks, where by this you must have achieved this, by this you must have achieved this, what we're doing is we actually cutting off the possibility of the child arriving at true abstraction by giving them packaged answers too early. So we want them to discover generalizations for themselves. And we really want the socialization of working together on a problem and letting the human tendencies reveal themselves in the second plane classroom. And it's here that the real learning happens, or in Montessori's terms, the formation and extension of the engrams. So the manipulative experience and the subsequent period of rest that allows for the formation of engrams or subconscious traces, and the psychic complexes that not only associate ideas, but organize themselves at new and higher levels. So what we see in the second phase, and what is significant about the second period, is that it provides repetition with variation, long work cycles, time for internalization, and the opportunity for extension of the concept and creativity. It is during the second period, through repetition and rehearsal, that received knowledge is transformed into declarative and procedural knowledge. So you start seeing deep levels of learning that you never see when children are just filling out worksheets or writing 5 sentences about lions. So the third period, what is that? The third period is a demonstration of learning. The children are aware of what they have learned. It's the light bulb moment, the aha moment. You see it when children are really working in the second period. All of a sudden, one of the things that I've observed in child after child after child on the second plane is when they work with the decanomial and they translate the bead decanomial, the carpet of the layout of the, it's a multiplication tables really. Some children right up until that point may not have memorized their multiplication tables, and just seeing it laid out as a decanomial is like, oh, okay, that's what it is. I get it, okay? But when they build that decanomial and swap out all those bead bars and end up with cubes and build it and look at it and say, it's the pink tower. It's actually the pink tower. Is the biggest cube in the pink tower really 1,000? What do you think? It must be. Yeah, sure, it is. That aha moment that can happen at age 11 or 12, I've seen it happen with a 15-year-old. The excitement, I want to go and get that pink tower. I want to look at 1,000. Although they've handled the golden beads, it never quite has that effect. So the children become aware of what they've learned. Now we've got to understand that we can't demand performance. Maybe they will want to tell the rest of the group or, you know, do a play or write a poem and then read it to the whole class, but they don't have to. The child can reveal their knowledge through application that is not shared. The adult recognizes that the child has arrived at the third period, but the child must never experience this as a test or evaluation. It's highly individualized, how they reach the points and how they share it. And this third period is true abstraction. So recognizing that the child has reached the third period is an indication that he or she is ready to move on to the next step in any sequence of learning where that step is required to move on. It's important because it's a type of knowing that's different from being able to produce the correct answer in a test or to choose the correct answer from a choice of answers in a multiple choice. It is knowledge that reveals itself through application. So this is very, very different. So how does this play out? So we know what Montessori intends us to do, and she says this over and over in her work about leaving the children free to explore, that their interest is the real guide of the work we should offer them. As the child gets older, the temptation to measure what the child knows increases with pressure in a performance-conscious culture. And a tendency to rush into a third period demonstration can cut short second period repetition and exploration necessary for internalization. In other words, we get superficial learning. Every well-trained elementary teacher adopts the mantra that one must sow as many seeds as possible. But it's also good to remember Margaret Stevenson's warning not to go digging up the seeds in order to see if they are germinating, to trust in the process of the child's self-construction. Now, I've chosen this picture to illustrate this because this little boy who was really struggling with numbers at one point, one day, and I had an assistant who was like trying to get him to do the multiplication tables, which he was doing with this Pythagoras board here. And he himself noticed that he could put the 2 on the 2 and the 3 on the 3 and the 4 on the 4 and build it up like this to get only half the board. Normally that's presented, but he hadn't ever done that before for whatever reason. And then he noticed that these numbers here were single, and those are the squares. And then he realized and recognized that those first 3 numbers matched those first 3 squares. And so he went and got the others and counted and matched them. And then he realized that those were square numbers with no presentation whatsoever. Now that's a pretty long way for a child who doesn't know their multiplication tables to get in abstract math. Well, it didn't take him long to learn his multiplication tables after this. The third period is the responsibility of the adult to accomplish as an act of observation, not an obligation of the child to perform. Very important to remember that. And then assessment is assessment towards planning the next lesson, towards building a repertoire of concepts and spiraling through keys for the child to explore in greater detail. It's not about requiring the child to perform something for us that we think we can measure. Pretty near the end, those of you who are getting a bit frustrated. So I like to think about this as a sandwich. In traditional education, the focus of learning is in the first and third stages. See the thick slices of bread. So the adult teaches, and then assesses. In fact, the didactic cycle or ensemble of traditional education is telling, questioning, and correcting, and then measuring. So without the significant period of free and independent exploration and the appropriate dialogue check-ins from the adults, without the repetition and opportunity for choice, true learning is not taking place at all. However, in the Montessori classroom, we have something significantly different. We have a second period where the second period is the huge mixture in the bottom of that sandwich. There's a discovery of relationship between things that leads to understanding takes place. The work in the second period is repetitive and recursive. And even in our lessons, we tend to be repetitive and recursive, and we offer variety, repetition with amplification, and repetition with intensification. We use something called the principle of the hook. We always give the child a hook to something they've already learned. Every good Montessori lesson, the key always says, remember when we spoke about, and we link back to something we know the child knows. I've seen you working with XYZ materials. Now I want to show you something else you can do with that. There's always a hook to something the child knows, and that catches interest. And there's foreshadowing that prepares the mind. You might be wondering what happens to something, but that's a story for another day. And the child is eager to know what's going to happen. I've got some pictures here. You can just think about the kind of work that's going on. Children trying to solve problems. I'm going to go very quickly. We've got a scaffold independent research, and there are always lessons within our albums, within our sequence of work that will do that, that don't entail what we would normally think it is. And I've got some sources there which I'll make available to you. And that is that.